This movie tells the tragic story of a man whose sacrifices for his family led to his ultimate humiliation and death. It's a captivating tale filled with twists and turns that will keep you glued to your screen. So grab your popcorn and let's dive into this unforgettable Nigerian movie. Welcome to my channel. Today, we'll explore another fascinating and popular Nigerian movie. It's not your usual storyline, so stay tuned and enjoy the journey. The story begins with a young, handsome man named Chris. One night, while asleep on his living room couch, he was startled awake by a strange man standing and staring at him. Frightened and confused, Chris asked what the man was doing in his house. The stranger ignored his question and instead demanded, "What did you do to my sister?" Chris couldn't respond, and the man began to attack him. Just as the violence escalated, Chris woke up. It had all been a dream. Meanwhile, Juliet was at her apartment, dressed and waiting for her friend to get ready. She was on the phone with Chris when her friend walked in, smiling but surprised. After ending the call, Juliet's friend teased her, saying it was too early to be talking to Chris. Juliet laughed and replied that no time was too early to talk to someone special. Despite her excitement, her friend expressed concerns about Chris, wondering if he might secretly be married or just too good to be true, given his Nollywood star status. Juliet reassured her friend that she genuinely liked Chris, and they both left for work. The next morning, Chris woke up in his pajamas, went downstairs, and found a note on the table that made him smile. He placed it back and returned to his room. Later, Juliet invited Chris over for lunch. When he arrived, she warmly welcomed him, and he surprised her with flowers, a sweet gesture. Chris complimented her home, and after some small talk, Juliet checked on her cooking while Chris occupied himself with his phone. At the same time, Musa, the gateman, was cleaning the gate when a man approached, asking about his boss. Musa explained that he didn't know his boss's whereabouts, but promised to deliver the man's urgent message once his boss returned. Back at Juliet's house, after lunch, Chris praised Juliet's cooking, saying it had been a long time since he'd enjoyed such a delicious meal. Seizing the moment, he asked Juliet to marry him. Although she was happy, she jokingly declined, saying he needed to propose properly, on one knee and during a candlelit dinner. Chris agreed to do it the right way, and after a hug, he left. On his way home, Chris's car was blocked by another vehicle. Two men got out and confronted him, mocking him as a lover boy, and accusing him of refusing to leave their sister alone. Confused, Chris tried to explain that he didn't know their sister, but they didn't listen and beat him up. They warned him to stay away from Juliet, claiming she was out of his league, and left him with the threat. Later that evening, Juliet was furious, scolding her brother for interfering in her personal life. Her friend chimed in, suggesting Chris might be a gold digger, but Juliet warned them both to stay out of her affairs and left angrily. Chris, nursing his injuries at home, was visited by his friend Femi, who advised him to go to the hospital to prevent infection. Chris refused, fearing media attention and wanting to protect Juliet. Femi also urged Chris to end things with Juliet, but Chris was determined to stay with her. Juliet later came by to apologize for not introducing him to her brothers, but Chris, still angry, asked her to leave. Despite her efforts to make amends, he couldn't forgive her for her brother's actions and their accusations of him being a gold digger. Meanwhile, Juliet's friend Rose and her brother were in a car, arguing about the attack on Chris. Rose, feeling guilty for betraying her friend, pleaded with Juliet's brother to leave Chris alone. However, he refused, vowing that they had only just begun. Later, Femi continued urging Chris to end the relationship, calling Juliet just another woman with complications. But Chris, deeply in love, refused to listen. The next morning, Rose went to visit Juliet. Upon arriving at the gate man refused to let her in, explaining that his boss had instructed him not to allow anyone inside. Skeptical, Rose tried calling Juliet, but her calls went unanswered. Left with no other choice, Rose left in disbelief. That evening, Juliet was at home when her brother barged in, startling her. Angrily, she warned him never to enter her house uninvited again. Her brother asked why she had been ignoring Rose's calls. Juliet explained that she wanted nothing to do with Rose, as Rose constantly interfered in her personal life. She also warned her brother to stay out of her relationship with Chris, revealing that Chris had already proposed to her and she had accepted before they interfered. Her brother, visibly upset, argued that they were only trying to protect her, claiming Chris was just a small boy. This made Juliet even angrier, and she ordered him to leave her house before storming off. 3 months later, Juliet ran into Femi and asked why he was in her neighborhood. Femi explained that he came to pick up a script for Chris. Juliet's mood shifted immediately, and she inquired about the storyline. When Femi mentioned it was a love triangle, Juliet became upset, expressing that she didn't want any women touching her husband. Femi tried to calm her down, assuring her that Chris was just doing his job and loved her deeply. Eventually, Juliet calmed down. By this time, Juliet and Chris were married and living happily, though their only recurring issue was her discomfort with the romantic roles Chris played in movies. That night, Chris was in the living room reading a movie script when Juliet joined him. She expressed her concerns about his roles in films, but Chris reassured her that acting was just a job and that she was the only woman he loved. She reluctantly accepted his explanation, appreciating his efforts to calm her down. The next morning, Juliet visited Chris's movie set, where she saw him kissing another woman during a scene. She became furious and embarrassed him on set, forgetting that it was part of his job. Later, at home with Rose, Juliet realized she had overreacted and expressed regret for her behavior. She admitted to Rose that she had acted impulsively and asked for advice on how to apologize to Chris. Rose suggested she apologize sincerely, like any responsible wife would. That night, when Chris returned home and sat on the couch, Juliet apologized for her actions earlier in the day. She also expressed her discomfort with his job, suggesting he start a new business, which she would finance. Although she pleaded with him, Chris remained silent and didn't respond. A few days later, Femi, worried about Chris, tried calling him but couldn't get through. He decided to visit Chris's house, where a new gateman informed him that Chris and his wife had moved out 6 months earlier. Shocked, Femi later managed to reach Chris by phone. Chris explained that he had shifted to a new line of business, but intended to return to the movie industry in a behind-the-scenes role. After their brief conversation, Chris ended the call. Juliet, overhearing part of the call, asked Chris who he had been speaking to, but he avoided answering and walked away. Their relationship had become strained since their relocation, with unresolved issues brewing between them. The next day, Juliet confided in her brothers about her marital problems, leading them to pursue Chris with the intention of assaulting him again. Chris, noticing the threat, ran into the house and demanded that Juliet warn her brothers to stay away, or he would involve the police. Juliet dared him to try, and they began arguing. As Chris tried to walk upstairs, Juliet followed him, continuing the argument. Later that evening, Chris returned home to find the house empty. Calling out for Juliet and their child, he received no response. Then he noticed a note on the table. Panicked, he rushed upstairs but found no sign of them. Desperate, he dashed to Juliet's brother's house, banging on their gate. When her brother appeared, he shouted at Chris and warned him never to return, claiming Chris would never see Juliet or their child again. That night, Chris, devastated and frustrated, drank heavily to cope with the pain. Overcome by alcohol, he passed out. The next morning, his sister visited and found him unconscious. She managed to wake him, and he broke down, crying and calling out for his wife and daughter. His sister consoled him, urging him to stay strong and freshen up. Later that day, Rose visited Juliet and was greeted warmly by Juliet's daughter, who had grown considerably. Inside, Rose asked Juliet about her conflict with Chris. Instead of addressing the issues calmly, Juliet began insulting Chris in front of her child. Rose intervened, sending the child to her room, and advised Juliet to stop speaking negatively about Chris in the child's presence. However, Juliet seemed resolute in her stance. The next morning, Chris was resting on the couch when Juliet's brother entered the house. Chris, startled, asked why he was there, but before he could finish, the brother started beating him severely. The assault left Chris with a serious head wound that required immediate medical attention. Chris woke up the next morning in the hospital, struggling to recall how he got there. The doctor informed him that he had sustained a skull injury requiring urgent surgery to prevent future seizures. Chris's sister, who was waiting anxiously outside the ward, prayed fervently for his recovery. When the doctor came out with news that Chris wasn't responding well to treatment and had been asking to see his daughter, his sister pleaded for the doctors to do everything possible to save his life. Early the next morning at Femi's house, he received a phone call. It was Chris. Overwhelmed with excitement, Femi jumped out of bed, waking his wife in the process. Thrilled to hear from Chris after such a long time, Femi eagerly listened as Chris revealed that he was in the hospital and gravely ill. Chris begged Femi to visit him, claiming he was dying. Although Femi's wife was skeptical about whether it was really Chris, Femi was certain it was him. Later that morning, Chris's sister went to Juliet's house to confront her and her brothers. She sarcastically congratulated them on ruining Chris's life and gave them a piece of her mind. She informed them that Chris was undergoing surgery due to their actions and demanded they let him see his daughter. For the first time, Juliet felt remorseful. That afternoon, Chris's sister asked the doctor why the surgery had not yet commenced. The doctor explained that Chris's blood pressure was too high, so the procedure had been rescheduled for the next day. Femi went to visit Chris in the hospital and was shocked at his deteriorated condition. Saddened, he asked Chris how things had gotten so bad. Chris recounted everything that had happened, and Femi was heartbroken. Chris then pleaded with Femi to help him locate his daughter. After their conversation, Femi's wife called him. He told her about Chris's critical condition, and she felt deeply sorry for him. While they were still on the phone, an emergency arose in the hospital. Femi quickly ended the call, promising to update her later. It turned out that Chris had developed a seizure, and the doctors were working to stabilize him. Outside the hospital ward, Juliet arrived with a remorseful expression, seeking to see Chris. However, Chris's sister, disgusted at the sight of Juliet, confronted her. Shortly after, the doctor arrived and broke the devastating news. Chris had passed away. The announcement left everyone, especially Femi, in utter shock. The next morning, Femi was mourning at home. His wife woke up and tried to console him. Meanwhile, Juliet was also crying as she visited her friend's house to grieve. Chris's death deeply affected Femi, leaving him sleepless and devastated. But his wife stood by him, offering support. The following day, Femi went to see Rose. He expressed how good a man Chris had been, calling him one of the most decent people he knew. Femi also informed Rose that the police were investigating Chris's death and warned her to pray that she wasn't implicated. Then he left. The next morning, Rose visited Juliet to apologize for making her doubt her husband. However, Juliet, still consumed with grief, refused to accept the apology. She blamed Rose and her brothers for turning her against Chris, which she believed led to his death. As they argued, Juliet received a phone call from one of her brothers, who called to apologize for Chris's death. Juliet angrily told him never to contact her again, threatening to have him arrested. Her brother revealed that the police were already pursuing him and had arrested another of their brothers. He begged for forgiveness, even if it meant dying in jail, so he could have peace of mind. Shortly after, their pastor came to pay his condolences. He asked if burial arrangements had been made, but Juliet and Rose admitted they knew nothing about it and asked the pastor to mediate with Femi. They gave him Femi's contact information. The following day, the pastor visited Femi. Later that day, Juliet was at home, drinking and crying while staring at a photo of Chris. She tearfully apologized to him, reflecting on how she had contributed to his death. She recalled the moments they shared, including the time she convinced him to leave his acting career and start a new business with her. Overwhelmed by guilt, she blamed herself for not stopping her brothers from humiliating him. While Juliet was still drinking and crying, Rose rushed in and took the bottle away. Juliet continued sobbing, lamenting that she had caused Chris's death. At that moment, the pastor and Femi walked in. Juliet, overwhelmed with guilt, asked them to arrest her for killing her husband. The pastor consoled her, urging her to stay strong. Juliet kept repeating that she should have stopped her brothers, but Femi interrupted, telling her she wouldn't be arrested. Instead, he assured her she would have a second chance to make things right. Confused, Juliet asked how that was possible. Then, Femi revealed the truth. Chris was alive. Juliet didn't believe it until the pastor confirmed it. Shocked and elated, she wiped her tears, thanking God. Rose also expressed her gratitude. The pastor asked Juliet to sit, and Femi used the moment to advise her. He explained that actors merely perform roles. Portraying a bad boy doesn't mean they are one in real life. He urged her to stop stigmatizing actors and to respect their profession, just like any other job. Finally, Juliet requested to see Chris, and Femi agreed. Together, they left to visit him. Did you enjoy this story? Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to this amazing channel and stay tuned for more interesting, captivating, and educative movies.